Eugenie Sage.
Mr. Chair, thank you for that. In my brief call, I'd like to talk about climate change and, if I get time, the Resource Management Act. Because this report of the Ministry for the Environment for 2014-15 talks about an outcome statement being that New Zealand becomes a successful low-carbon society that is resilient to climate change impacts on its climate, economy and lifestyle. A very laudable outcome with which the Green Party would agree. And we've got $3.4 million having been spent to support policy making by ministers and another $7.5 million for resource management policy advice. Yet all of this money has failed to deliver decent advice on adapting to climate change. And we've seen that the national government's got an extremely weak stance on reducing our climate emissions, but it's also not ensuring that we prepare for the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise. 5 months ago, last November, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment delivered a report which made 8 recommendations on how we could start to tackle the impacts of sea level rise. Yet the Minister for Finance, Bill English, seems to think that sea level rise is speculative. The PCE recommended that there be a working party established to look at the fiscal and economic implications of sea level rise. But according to Minister English, there are other more pressing, more immediate issues. That is despite the fact that the Parliamentary Commissioner has identified a $20 billion cost of replacing just the homes which are potentially at risk in low-lying areas from the impacts of coastal erosion, more coastal flooding and a higher water table associated with rising sea levels. So the government has failed to act there. The minister has failed to act also in providing clear national guidance to local authorities in terms of how they deal with sea level rise. And it needs to provide that national direction under the RMA. What have we seen? The most recent guidance for local authorities in terms of the amount of sea level rise that they should plan for dates back to 2008 under the former Labor government. It talks about a rise of 0.8 of a metre by 2100. Yet since then, we've had several reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We need new guidance. I understand it's being developed in the ministry, but we haven't seen it yet. And I was at a seminar just last week in a room full of quite anxious planners, some property and insurance experts and scientists when they were highlighting that the risks of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets melting can significantly exacerbate the rate of sea level rise. Potentially, just from the West Antarctic ice sheet alone, 2 metres of sea level rise in a generation. Yet what is this Ministry for the Environment doing under this government? It is failing to ensure that we have consistent national direction with a national policy statement on sea level rise and natural hazards. It's leaving it to coastal communities to deal with this challenging issue on their own. And we've seen what happens in Kapiti and in Christchurch, where those councils tried to take a long-term view, tried to include provisions in their plans to control development in areas that were at risk of coastal hazard, at risk of rising seas. There's substantial pushback, and both councils withdrew those provisions. So the national government is being completely irresponsible by failing to provide that consistent national guidance. It's leaving it to the communities in low-lying areas of Napier, on Wellington's south coast, in South Dunedin and the eastern suburbs of Christchurch to have to cope on their own. We had the Minister for Climate Change admitting in the House yesterday that councils aren't providing enough guidance to communities about the potential impacts of sea level rise, the risk to property values. How are we going to solve that? The government's got its head in the sand. It needs to tackle this issue because, as the Parliamentary Commissioner has said, we have got time to plan, but we have to start planning now. Her report came out 5 months ago and we've seen no action by the government. A $20 billion cost, Mr Chair, for the replacement of homes. Yet the Finance Minister has failed to set up a working group to look at this in more detail. It may be that the government has got an economic policy that, like the costs of the rebuild after the Christchurch earthquakes, it thinks that somehow this is going to spur economic activity if it leaves communities to be inundated and having to cope with issues on their own.
The Honourable Minister.